All right, gang. So this is our last episode or last lesson that we're going to talk about economic geography. And what I want to address today is we're going to kind of wrap everything up, and we're going to talk about the differences between a developed country and a developing nation. The example that I constantly try to give you guys is that a developed country is someplace where you want to live, and a developing nation maybe not. Okay, probably not someplace you want to live, or it's at least someplace where your standard of living and your life would change dramatically if you moved away from like the U.S. and moved into a developing nation. Okay, so indicators of success. So in a developed country, they've got lots of advanced technology. They have a really strong infrastructure. And remember, strong infrastructure means reliable roads, reliable communication, access to doctors. When you poop, your poop goes away. You don't have to poop in a hole. Okay? Developing nations have very limited technology, which means their communication systems aren't very good, and they have very weak or non-existent infrastructure. And again, the example that I give of that is they don't have consistent power. Their electricity may not stay on all day long. Maybe it's only 4 hours a day or 5 hours a day. Okay? Human resources. In developed countries, human resources are very highly educated and very highly skilled. So we're talking at least a high school diploma, and we're talking very highly skilled and able to do a lot of different jobs, very highly specialized. Developing countries are poorly trained. 8th grade education is the max, is typically the max or the average, rather, and they're very lowly skilled. Levels of economic development. Developing nations have a low GDP. Okay, low GDP is something that I told you to define as less than 15,000 or 10,000 per capita. Okay, developing country GDP or a per capita income of less than $5,000. Now, I told you guys in class less than 10,000 or so, and I would still hold to that. But if you are below $5,000 of per capita income, you're certainly living in a developing nation, if that's the nation's average. Developed countries have a very high gross domestic product. We're talking over $35,000 or more per person in a developed country, with a per capita income of over $20,000. People in developed countries live in cities. So we're talking over half of the population, or half of the population or more, live in urban areas, in cities. They are city dwellers. In a developing nation, what we see is migration. Okay? There's less of a population living in the cities, but there's a big shift. There's a major population shift to move toward the cities, and those cities are growing. Okay? Economic activity. Levels of economic activity in a developed country. Tertiary is the largest part. So lots of people are doing jobs that involve serving other people, working, distributing things, fixing cars, plumbers, doctors. You are doing more to fix things than you are to make things or even pull stuff out of the ground. In a developing nation, most people have the #1 job in the world, which is a subsistence agriculture, subsistence farmer. Okay, remember, farming for subsistence is farming to feed your family, and that's the #1 job. So that's a primary job, or main job rather, is primary economic activities. They are working mostly in agriculture. Secondary jobs are smaller. They do have some manufacturing, but very few people work in tertiary level economic activities. So let's look at developed countries. Educational achievement, which we talked about earlier. Most have a high school diploma. Many have a college diploma in a developed country. In a developing nation, there's very little education opportunity beyond an 8th grade education. Developed countries have lots of natural resources or access to natural resources, and we include in there water, oil, natural gas, other things, other mineral resources are great. And developing nations have little or limited access. Or if they do have access to natural resources, they're hard to get to, very hard to mine, very hard to pull out, or maybe they only have one thing that they mine or have. Okay? Population characteristics. Here's what the population looks like, population demographics look like. Developed countries have very moderate or slow growth and maybe even negative growth in their population, whereas developing countries are typically developing or growing, their population is growing very quickly. A developed country, their population pyramid is going to look like a diamond. Remember, because they're wealthy, they can afford the diamonds. Girls, you want the bling when you get married, right? Well, they can afford them in developed countries. So it's either going to look like this, or it's also going to look like a cylinder. Let me draw a cylinder for you guys real quick. that's important to remember is that in a developed country now, what we're noticing, population trend is looking much more like a cylinder, and I'll color that in. Wow, it's really bad. Looking much more like a cylinder than it is a pyramid or even a triangle. Developing nations, they still look a little bit like that triangle, but even them are starting to look more like a diamond or a little bit different. Literacy rate. In a developed country, more than 90% of the population of the world can read or write a simple sentence about, or population of the country can read or write a simple sentence, and developing nations are anywhere below 60%. Again, that goes back to the levels of education. They have limited access to education, and therefore their literacy rates are much lower. Life expectancy in a developed country is between 75 and 80 years of age, and that's generally you can expect to live that long because better health care. You have more access to doctors, clean drinking water, things like that. You don't have as much stress in your life. You don't have to farm every day. Your job doesn't involve that. If you work out, it's because you choose to. It's not because you have to put food on your plate. Okay? In a developing nation, we're looking at anywhere from 50 to 60 years old is the life expectancy of a country in there. Infant mortality in a developed nation is somewhere around 7 per 1,000 babies. And that's about as low as nature will allow it. Nature will not allow the birth rate, or rather infant mortality rate, to drop much below that. Okay? In developing nations, it can be very high. It can be anywhere from 10 to 12 to 20 or 30 babies die per 1,000 in a year. That's a lot per 1,000 babies. That's pretty high. Agriculture done in developed countries is agribusiness. Remember, I mentioned earlier in one of the lessons that agribusiness, they're big agricultural industry, big companies that take over and run farms. They're taking them away from small family farmers, and that's another example of that. In a developing nation, most people are subsistence farmers, okay, and that's the type of agriculture that they do. Subsistence, again, is raising or growing crops that you can feed your family. We don't do that here in America. Most of us, if we're growing crops, it's because we like to or we want to have fun. It's not because we have to put food on our table. Okay? There's a very low percentage of people involved in agriculture in a developed country. In America, I think it's something about 5% or less of Americans are involved in some sort of agricultural activity. In a developing nation, that's going to be very high. So we're looking over 50% or so of the population is involved in some sort of agricultural activity. All right. So last but not leastly, in your notes, there was some information there about what to do on page 70. But in your notes, the last thing it says, in developing countries, the major cities are more connected to the regions outside, in countries outside, than within. And it's due to the fact that they have a poorly developed infrastructure. Cities in developing countries are more connected to the outside because other areas, other cities, don't have as nice as agriculture, okay? And they're not as connected, or not agriculture, nice as infrastructure, so they're not as well connected. Take a look at this next slide, and I want you to be able to look at this and tell me which ones are the developed countries and which one are the developing, and use the information that we talked about to figure that out. All right? I hope you have a great day. You guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys when you get back from your spring break, and I hope you enjoyed your time. Bye-bye.